Welcome back to Newslink. Now, defence budget cuts are currently killing soldiers. That was the sentiment shared by SA Navy Chief Monde Lobese, and he was speaking at a memorial of 3 naval submariners who died just off Kommetjie in the Western Cape. Now, Lobese is calling on government to stop slashing budgets, and he further says while the budget is cut every year, the constitutional mandate remains the same. Let's discuss this with Darren Olivier from the African Defence Review, joining me this morning for this conversation. And Darren, thank you so much for your time and a very warm good morning to you. Let's talk about particularly budgets allocated to the defence. At this stage, I mean, how are they looking?
Honestly, terrible. I mean, the SANDF budget in general has been cut from an average of 1.5% of GDP back in late 90s to about 0.72% now. So effectively just an onward and continuous decline in real terms over the last 25, 30 years. It's at a point where it just cannot be sustained. This is probably the worst year in terms of availability across the SANDF, across the Air Force, the Navy, the Army. It's becoming just impossible to maintain all of the prime mission equipment at the rate required to actually meet requirements. So, of course, what you have is this huge decline in defence spending, effectively a halving of the budget. In general, the defence budget across the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army is half of what it should be. Yet the requirements haven't changed. It's still the same size, it's still the same number of bases, still the same number of missions. So at some point, something has to give. And what's been giving so far is that obviously the operations and training budget has shrunk, as has the budget to acquire and upgrade. And these combined mean that over time, you can just grind to a halt.
Darren, the Chief of the Navy, Monde Lobese, here says that the budget cuts are annually. They see annual budget cuts. Yet, as you've mentioned, the constitutional mandate remains the same. He even is quoted saying that they're expected to perform miracles with this, constant budget cuts. Do we know why they are experiencing, or the defence is experiencing, budget cuts?
Defence is an easy one to cut. Effectively that. I mean, there's another 1.9 billion rand cut this year. That's on top of additional cuts in terms of allocations to human resources. The issue is that defence, as they say, has no consistency. When it comes to a budget that is overall in trouble in terms of government spending, and there's a need to find some fiscal space and to make available more money for healthcare, for policing, for education, it's really easy to then take that money away from defence, or at least to hold defence steady while you then decline in real terms. That's really the issue, is that there's no proper strategic framework in place to say we should be spending a certain amount of money, a certain percentage of the GDP on defence, and then stick to that. But because there is no such framework and no such commitment, and there is no real consistency that's really, I think, defending the defence allocation, that means that any time there's a requirement to find money, you just go back to the SANDF, because so far the cuts have happened and people aren't generally seeing the effects. But these effects are having, effectively they're compounding. So we're going to see it more and more and more and more. We're going to see more failures in terms of the Air Force, for example, not being able to respond to disasters, maybe not being able to put ships at sea. These have all been quite, I think, hidden until now. So people haven't realized how bad the cuts are. And for that reason, it's been something that has kind of fallen under the radar. But effectively what we need is the ability to have a new defence review, for example, which then creates a peg and says, you will get a certain level of spending according to GDP for the next 10, 20 years. And that doesn't exist. So long as it doesn't exist, it's really easy for Treasury to then take money away. And I think, honestly, I blame the Minister of Defence, well, not just this one, but the other ones too, is that for so many ministers of defence, there has not been a good enough defence of their own budget. Not only that, the reason why it needs a budget that high.
Right.
So, they're saying the Minister of Defence are doing an awful job of explaining what the budget is for, why it needs to be a certain level, and really hard to maintain that.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I was just also listening to the Chief of the Navy here, Monde Lobese, also further saying that if the budget cuts continue, then it might also be the right thing to do to reduce their responsibilities as well. So the cuts actually match up with their responsibilities. Do you think that's a fair point and even possible at all?
I mean, absolutely. You either, this is something we've been calling for many years, is that you cannot continue as you are. If the budget will remain low or be cut further, then the only thing to do that is responsible is to cut the size requirements and mandate. So, I mean, to give you an idea, the Navy requires refits and very, very serious maintenance actions for its submarines and vessels. Of those, I mean, the budget for those that's outstanding is 4 billion rand. They've done, almost none of them because there hasn't been budget made available over the last 15 years of service. You cannot continue without those refits being done. At some point, you have to just stop using those vessels. So really, there is no path forward in which we can keep the budget the way it is and keep the capability and in any kind of meaningful form. So then the answer is yes. If there is no additional allocation, which, I mean, given South Africa's financial allocation seems to be the case, then we need to start looking to actually cut back capabilities, cut back personnel, cut back on all kinds of things. So, potentially retire the frigates, retire the submarines, retire many types of aircraft, reduce the size of the army, close down bases. These are all things that are being discussed internally. But then the public needs to understand that once you do that, it's very, very, very difficult and very expensive to reestablish it, often to the point it becomes impossible. And secondly, it means that the SANDF will not be able to do many missions. So that's a trade-off. There's no way you can get the capability that our force design implies on the current spending. Something must give.
Darren, I think also the alarming, thing as well is that there's also an additional cost to these budget cuts, fatalities, as we've seen recently in the Kommetjie tragedy. And again, we're hearing or seeing the sense rather that, these cuts, because they're a challenge, obviously, to amongst other things, obviously to, regarding maintenance issues that obviously the Navy has to endure, issues around budgeting and so forth. It seems the sentiment here is that this is a costly budget cut towards life. Are we seeing a link here between the cuts in budgets within the defence as well as the number of injuries or even fatalities as we've seen recently? And furthermore, could this be a common thing that South Africa may need to prepare for, injuries and fatalities due to these cuts?
Yes. I mean, there's no two ways about it. When people don't train at the tempo they require, they're good enough practice. It doesn't matter how well trained they are, how competent they are, how professional they are, they won't be as sharp as they should be. This applies to anything. And therefore, the more you cut back on training time, on the ability to practice, on the availability of aircraft, ships, tanks, whatever the case may be, you increase the possibility of incidents, accidents, and mistakes. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that the submarine incident of Kommetjie was to do that. We don't know the cause yet. But we do know that when you take personnel like this who are highly trained, highly skilled, operating in very, very dangerous conditions, and you take away much of their ability to do ongoing practicing, you do increase the possibility of errors and mistakes. Completely human. I mean, it happens to the best forces in the world. And we're seeing it not only in terms of training mistakes, we're seeing in terms of the availability of assets to support operations. I mean, we know that one of our soldiers potentially could have survived in Mozambique had there been sufficient aircraft support. But the availability is so low that we don't have enough aircraft over there. Same thing in Bangui, when ideally they would have had air support and perhaps those 15 wouldn't have died. That will continue happening. It'll get worse and worse and worse and worse. And this is why, I mean, South Africans should honestly be furious at the fact that we are sending the people into harm's way. We're asking them to keep doing these things, keep doing these highly complex operations and exercises, but not providing the level of funding they're required to do them properly.
Darren, quite a concern indeed that we have to highlight, and thank you so much for speaking to me about this this morning. Quite important to highlight some of those complexities, the challenges incurred, but also what's really happening behind the scenes that perhaps most South Africans were not aware of. So thank you so much, Darren Olivier, for joining me right here on Newslink from the African Defence Review.